Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, Yoga Alliance community and friends. My name is Patricia Anderson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Yoga Humanities Week here at Yoga Alliance. I will be your host for today. I also have an RYT 200, and I am grateful to acknowledge that I am coming to you from lands that were once inhabited by the indigenous Anacostan people of what is now known as the United States. And that area is now called the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. As I mentioned, it's Yoga Humanities Week. This workshop is eligible for continuing education credit for our Yoga Alliance members. And you as a member will go ahead and enter those credits in the teacher dashboard. I've just popped up our location poll. Now that you know which continent I am on, if you wouldn't mind sharing which continent you were on, that would be great. As many of you know, I serve as the executive producer for digital content here at Yoga Alliance. I'm actually a consultant to Yoga Alliance. And behind the scenes today, we have a couple of very talented humans who are captioning while I talk. I'm originally from New York. I talk fast. That's not an easy job. So if you could extend them some grace, we'd really appreciate it. Today is a third part in what is now going to be actually a four-part series brought to you by Chelsea Roff, who's the founder of Eat, Breathe, Thrive. Today, we're going to talk about the science behind the connection between yoga and yoga, rather, as a tool for healing in eating disorders. So a couple of things to know about this session. Number one, although the folks that you're talking to are scientific experts, they're not here to dispense actual medical advice. If you're having a particular situation, we always encourage you to seek your own guidance and healing through licensed medical professionals. We're here to educate today to help you as yoga teachers learn more about eating disorders and disordered eating and understand how it might impact the students who are coming to your classes, whether they be in person or online. The fourth session, which is coming up in a couple of weeks, will be a pure Q&A. Chelsea and I have been really moved, I would say, and surprised by how many folks have just basic questions about eating disorders, disordered eating, how to help folks. So we're going to have a whole Q&A session. A little bit later, I'll pop that registration info into the chat so you can sign up for that. But for today, I would just say welcome, and let me introduce to you our two speakers. So our presenter today is Chelsea Roff. She has a CIAYT, and she's also, as I mentioned, the founder and director of Eat, Breathe, Thrive, which is a nonprofit organization that helps people overcome eating disorders. Chelsea is a yoga therapist, educator, and research collaborator, and she has spent the better part of a decade working to make integrative health programs available to people with mental health challenges. And we're also joined today by Dr. Catherine Cook-Cottone, not sure why my tongue isn't working, probably because it's Monday, who is an IAYT, a psychologist, yoga therapist, and professor at the University of Buffalo, which is part of the State University of New York system here in the US. She has written 8 books and over 75 research articles and chapters on embodiment, self-regulation, eating disorders, and trauma. She is a co-founder of Yogis in Service, and in 2018 was awarded the American Psychological Association's Citizen Psychologist Presidential Citation. She is the co-editor-in-chief of Eating Disorders, Journal of Treatment and Prevention, and the author of Embodiment and the Treatment of Eating Disorders. Yes, I will post all of this in the chat and also give you her link so you can learn more about these two really phenomenal people who are joining us today. I can't really think of too many other better ways to acknowledge International Women's Day than by nerding out on important issues with two phenomenal women. And one last thing I'll just say now that I just made a whole big thing about women, eating disorders affect people of all genders. And so just want to put that out there. I will stop talking now and turn it over to our guests. Chelsea and Dr. Catherine, welcome, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Patricia. Happy International Women's Day to you and to everyone here, whether you identify as a woman or as as a human, if you love those who identify as women, if you came out of someone who identifies as a woman, which is most of us on the planet. So yeah, just honoring that, Patricia. Thank you for honoring that with us. I'm so happy to be here today with one of my favorite women in my life and in my career. I actually gave her a shout out this morning because I was like, gosh, who are the people that have really influenced me recently in my life and my career? And I was like, gosh, Catherine's been such an important mentor in my life. And we've gotten to do lots of little online events recently. So she just gets loved up every time we're in a virtual room together. Yeah, so I want to welcome those of you who are returning. It's been a real delight to be here and to see Patricia at least once every couple of weeks and to have reasons to chat with her via email. And it's also been a delight to hold this space with you and to participate in these conversations and dialogues with you. I see your questions every week and every other week, and I'm really looking forward to answering them. And I'm also really honored to bring somebody today who can help me answer them because she is a scientist. She does have loads of knowledge in this area. So I was like, phew, at least I don't have to answer all those by myself. So I'm honored to be here with Dr. Catherine Cook-Cottone. Patricia gave a really wonderful introduction. I guess what I'll add is Catherine is at this really wonderful intersection between yoga, a practice that I know has benefited all of our lives. If you're here today, you wouldn't be here otherwise. Science and the search for knowledge, evidence, information so that we can I really think of science as so much more than just the study of or biology class. It's really looking at how do these things work? Why do they work? Who do they work for? Like, does it affect people of all socioeconomic groups the same? Does it affect people of all gender identities the same, ethnicities the same? So Catherine's really working at that investigation and really comes to her work with a sense of curiosity and a willingness to learn from whatever the data presents. Also, science is what gets us in the door in government and in public policy so that we can make these practices available to as many people as possible. And then in addition to that, she runs a nonprofit in Buffalo that serves people in all walks of different lives and all different walks of life. And she's a person that knows the inside of mental health challenges, both in her own experience and because she's a human being that knows and loves people and has daughters and has family members. So this is such an honor to be here with you, Catherine. Any excuse to get into a Zoom room with you. And I guess, yeah, I could go on about you forever. And I just was like, let's keep it
good.
In the interest of me not talking, I gave a good introduction to you. Do you want to say a little bit about your work? And then also, I'm going to hand it off to you in terms of how you and I met one another, because it's interesting context to throw into the mix.
Yeah, so I didn't intentionally forge a way into yoga. I was actually a student who was in my class at the university and was telling me how my work was so aligned with yoga philosophy and invited me to take a yoga class from her. And I said, oh, I can't. I'm the kind of person that they put in the back of the dance recital kind of person, And she goes, no, it's not what you think. I just thought it was for gymnasts and former dancers and that. And I fell in love with yoga at the first few breaths. And from there, I thought this has to be an integral part of me understanding self-regulation. And that journey came from a really personal place, just from my own struggles with disordered eating and struggling with the interface between how I regulate myself internally and how I negotiate the world outside and all of the demands and pressures and the empathy that I experience. And so yoga, really, given all the different approaches I had tried, became one of the most powerful tools in negotiating that interface between me and the world, so that I could maintain my role as both my own kind of mentor and nurturer, right? And then the world and being effective out there. So that's how that happened. And in that journey, I became involved with Lululemon as part of the not-for-profit organization, and they would get a bunch of us together every year or so. And Chelsea and I were placed as roommates, and I we didn't know who our roommates would be. And she's like, "Oh, research! I want to research, eat, breathe, thrive." And so as a researcher in the yoga community, you get approached all the time by people who want, you to participate in research, and you only have so much that you can do, and funding is always an issue. So finally, after interacting for a while, I took her aside and I said, "Come outside with me for a moment," really private space. And I'm like, "All right, I'll help you." Don't tell anyone. So she charmed me, and then we were able to get funding, and thank you to Lululemon for a really generous research grant, and we've just continued from there.
I was going to say, I proceeded to tell everyone on the face of the planet. I was like, guess what? Yeah, it was a wonderful thing. It was when Catherine and I started working together, there was a little bit of, ooh, do we really want to be working with Lululemon around eating disorder research? There was lots of conversations around sizing and around images and how they did marketing. And so one thing I'm proud of, we don't have time to go into here, is how we've leveraged that relationship a little bit to advocate for change in sizing. They went from a size 12 up to a size 20, and they're talking about going above and beyond that to changes in imagery and all that sort of stuff. But it was a really delightful connection. I was like, oh, I can't believe they put me with a roommate. I go up and I'm like, "Hi, I'm Chelsea." And she's like, "Hi, I'm Catherine Cook-Cottone." And I'm like, shut the front door. I can't believe they put me with her. So it was a good bond. Catherine, I want to dig right in. And I guess the backstory here is Catherine and I have worked together for the past 4 years to study the efficacy of a yoga curriculum, which is the one we offer at Eat, Breathe, Thrive for people with eating disorders. So we've done randomized control trials out in the community across many different cities in 3 different countries. Which has taught us a lot. We're right now just launched a study looking at a virtual version of the program. We've done qualitative research, which is really wonderful because instead of asking people to fill out questionnaires, you can say, "Tell me about your experience. What was helpful? What wasn't helpful?" And really listen. So we've done a lot of stuff. And then Catherine herself has been doing research for many years on eating disorders. So one thing that I've heard over the course of these sessions, and I had one idea about what I was going to talk to Catherine about, and I was like, okay, I'm hearing what's needed in these sessions. One thing that's come up among a lot of yoga teachers is a curiosity around who gets eating disorders. So is it, Patricia alluded to this in the beginning, oftentimes people assume that eating disorders just affect a very particular subset of the population, generally young, generally white, generally appearing female or identifying as female. So I wondered, Catherine, if you can speak to that I would call it a myth a little bit, or at least an oversimplification. Can you speak a little bit to, we've covered what eating disorders are. Can you talk a little bit about the eating disorder spectrum and who's affected by this illness we know as eating disorders?
Yeah, so when we're talking about eating disorders, primarily we're speaking about anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and then binge eating disorder, and then in some also the avoidant and restrictive food intake disorder, which in some people believe could be a variant of anorexia, but it is about restricting food. So when we look at the risk for those eating disorders, it is actually misleading to think that and I think harmful to think that it is only white middle class females that are struggling. Carolyn Becker is doing some fascinating work around food insecurity. And what her research team has found is that people who experience food insecurity are at an increased risk for binge eating, dietary restraint, and compensatory behaviors, and also are more likely to internalize weight stigmatization, which we know can be a driver for binge eating disorder. So that's the kind of misnomer about the middle class aspect. Another one is that it's females. And so
Can I ask you, wait, before you go on, can I ask you, just because I've said this to you before, you're wickedly intelligent, break down some of those terms for us. What does food insecurity mean? What does weight stigmatization mean? What were the other words you said? Food avoid, compensatory behaviors. What are those terms?
Okay. Thank you. Well, food insecurity means you don't know for sure when the next meal is coming, right? And often people who are food insecure are in poverty. They also can come from unstable households where even if they aren't in poverty, the caretakers aren't able to provide food on a regular basis. Many people live in what we call food deserts, where it is very difficult to secure food because there aren't grocery stores, or if there are places that sell food, it's not quality food. It has to do a lot with socioeconomic status, really, because it is about, can I afford food, or can I afford to get an Uber to go get my food? Can I carry it back? So there's just so much. Or parents are working, 2 and 3 jobs and still not cutting it. And so kids really don't know when the next meal is coming for sure. And so it was just breakthrough, groundbreaking work that Carolyn did. Now, so when we talk binge eating is when you eat a lot of food in a short amount of time and to the point where you feel a bit out of control. Dietary restraint is just restricting food, so eating less than you would need to eat. Weight stigmatization is when we kind of judge people and have biases about people because of their weight, whether it's too high or too low. And in this case, in particular, we're talking about people being stigmatized for being overweight. So does that help?
Can you wrap that all together and give the aha again? So people that are living in a place where they don't know where the next meal is going to come from, or food insecurity.
I often think, oh, you don't know where, so you're not going to have an eating disorder. You're just going to be, I guess, I don't know, just thankful for your next meal. So we kind of have this image of the middle class white female going on a diet and trying to be pretty, and that's who's at risk. And that really isn't how it ends up breaking down. It goes across race, it goes across gender. And in particular, in this example I'm providing, we're talking about people that urban and rural not having predictable food sources, and they are at risk for the variety of eating disorder behaviors that then can evolve into clinical presentation, into a diagnosis with one of those disorders I labeled.
That's so good. So it's really counterintuitive. Like you said, I think people have an assumption that if someone is living in poverty or isn't sure where the next meal is going to come from, the last thing they're going to be thinking about is the way their body looks, or the last thing they're going to be dealing with is an eating disorder, because they're just grateful to have their food. It's that idea when you I know my mom would say, like, you should just be grateful that you've got food on the table, but actually in that context and that situation can actually be the breeding ground for these struggles. And so there's a real mismatch between how eating disorders are conveyed in the media and even in the yoga world versus how people really struggle. And going back, I'll just mention this, and then I want Dr. Cook-Cottone to continue on, going back to the things we talked about in our past webinars. The issue isn't that people that are outside that stereotype don't struggle. It's those are the people that show up in traditional forms of treatment in the US, right? So those are the people that can afford to go to residential treatment. Those are the people that get counted. Those are the people that get Lifetime movies made out of them. That's not the reality of how eating disorders affect the population. Okay, I'll shut up. Continue.
You can kind of think back, and I hadn't planned to talk about this, but we look back to the Keyes study. So back in World War II, we allowed for conscientious objectors to the war. And that would mean that you felt like for a variety of reasons you couldn't participate in war. Well, they were also then eligible to participate in research, and we wanted to better understand how to refeed Europe. People were starving across Europe due to the war and the cutoff of food supply, and the United States wanted to study how to refeed Europe. And so they hired this Dr. Keyes to study food restriction, calorie restriction among typical males, and this conscientious objector group was studied, and there was a long-term study that actually had to be, we could never do this study these days because of protections for participants, but those individuals, males, conscientious objectors, and they were, I think the average age was in the 20s, of many of them went on to develop disordered eating. So the act of food restriction, whether you're restricting yourself or somebody else is restricting the food for you, that can put you at risk. So this is a whole bunch of people we don't typically think of. Sure, there's people who went on diets and created their own sense of restriction, but also there are situations that creates, whether you volunteered for a study on restriction or you live in a neighborhood where food's not available or nutrition's not available, that puts you at risk for disordered eating down the road. Among foster children, the rates of disordered eating is 8 times higher than the typical population. So we're talking about, like, we really do misunderstand who's at risk. And it also speaks to the power and the importance of community yoga in communities where they don't have access, because yoga gives you a pathway back to healthy embodiment in these at-risk populations.
Yeah, we're going to go there next. So the study, Patricia, because you're doing so well in the chat, is the shorthand for people like me is Minnesota starvation experiment. You'll get quite a few hits, but the aha for me reading that was, wow, you take men that would have been going to war, people that identify as men, and you put them on a very, very low calorie diet, and they develop behaviors that look a lot like anorexia. So essentially you forcibly starve them, and then when you give them food again, they don't want to eat, and they start developing behaviors like cutting their food into tiny pieces, hiding food, becoming obsessed with recipes that look a lot like anorexia, and you can't actually get them to start eating again after. I'm oversimplifying it, but for the yoga teachers in the room, the insight is, we think that eating disorders are choices. We think that, eating disorders just affect people who really want to be skinny. And the reality is it's so much more complicated than that. And especially right now, in the middle of a global pandemic, when more people than ever are out of work, when more people than ever don't know where their next meal is going to come from, more of your students than ever are likely struggling with this. Likely don't have a real, because that's where our mental health struggles often come out, is in our relationship with food. Having said that, what can you do? Why? You're a yoga teacher, you're here, you're like, this is fascinating and slightly depressing. What can I do? What role does yoga play? So Catherine, you could speak, and I know you have spoken for hours on this, and I recommend listening to her for hours. But can you speak a little bit to the science of why yoga works with these illnesses, specifically, mechanisms of change? How does yoga work? Why does it seem to help so many folks with eating disorders like Maris, who joined us last time? Why does it seem to have such a profound impact on their lives?
So there's a variety of theories, and we can go back. I explored this really in depth when I was writing the embodiment book, because I wanted to really understand the philosophical framework and then how that informed all of the research studies that have been done to date. So when we think back to like the old kind of Cartesian mind body, like that I have this objective body and this subjective mind, and I kind of split myself into this kind of thinking self that manages this lower almost like lower caste experience of the material self, that there's this split, right? And especially in the eating disorder risk world, we have this sense of like, I'm not my body, that my body is something I'm going to control, manage, suppress, change the size and shape of it, be dissatisfied with it, be in a battle with it. I know for me, and my experience was like, I just was in a fight with my body. I wanted it to feel different. I wanted it to do different things. I wanted it to be stronger, not as nervous, all of that, right? And it was like, I'll manage it from up here. So what real yoga practice does is it asks us, it like brings us back. And Merleau-Ponty is a French phenomenologist who really said, you know, the mind and body are equivalent, integrated, interwoven experiences that have wisdom. And the wisdom of the mind is not superior to the wisdom of the body. The experience of the mind is not superior to the experience of the body, that this is all just who you are. I am my body. Your brain is tissue, your muscles are tissue, the whole thing is a material thing. These are all the same thing. And so what yoga brings us to, I mean, the yoking, right? Like the integration of the spiritual self, the material self, in its essence is the antidote for the what is kind of the separation that happens in disordered eating. So we slowly through our practices, like through all 8 limbs, bring ourselves really back together into this whole, this whole of an embodied being. And then when I decide like I'm in an experience and I'm figuring out like, is this person my friend? Is what happening to me okay right now? Is there an action I should take? I tap into not only like what I think, but into the wisdom of my belly, into the sensations of my muscles moving and my body responding, and my ability to be in and of that moment and be in and of action and be in and of knowing comes from my whole entire body because of my practices. So I'll go a little bit further. So then the studies, how we start to design them, we say, okay, what is that? Like, what can we measure about that? And so we're looking at how can state mindfulness, me practicing being mindful, move into a trait mindfulness that can move me into being more mindful in my life off the mat. How can state practices of self-compassion as I fall out of a pose and I know this is a human experience to fall out of poses, and I ground my feet and I take a breath and I head back in, that self-compassion, right? How does that move into trait self-compassion that I carry around and share as I am in the world, right? So so it goes and on. How does this state gratitude move into? How does the ability to ground and breathe and recenter before I move into another pose, how does that move into me at a meeting, me with a lover, me with my children, right? So it's
Can
this practice.
Can I pause you really quick? Because you're going to get really into this stuff. And it's really good. And I don't want to lose anyone along the way. So I'm just imagining, given the yoga teachers here, you said something that to you and I is really intuitive, but might not be so intuitive to many yoga teachers. Or two things. One, you pointed out there's like the nature of an eating disorder, no matter how it shows up, or disordered eating, is a disconnect between mind and body. So it's the mind saying, I want my body to do this, and I'm going to overcome hunger, or I'm going to overcome fullness so that I can feel a certain way, or all of that, or I'm going to make my body do something in order to get to a feeling state. So that's an important thing that Dr. Cook-Cottone pointed out. But the other thing you said that may be very counterintuitive to many yoga teachers is that yoking and that union, that the mind and the body are deeply integrated, that they're not different at all, and that the idea of a mind transcending the body might not actually be the thing to aspire to. And that's fairly controversial in yoga, Catherine, right? Because there's so many texts and there's so many ways that modern yoga teachers interpret texts that are like, if I meditate long enough, if I become a good enough yogi, then I can transcend my body. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, because it sounds like what you're speaking to that's healing in eating disorders is actually the coming into the body and embracing it as the bedrock of human experience and not something to be gotten away from. But can you speak to that?
Well, and actually, if you really, 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 really dig into yoga, the transformation, the transcendence comes through the body. Like when you kind of look like how it's all situated, we're talking about the experience of the spirit through the senses, right? That how we interface the sensational self, the perceiving self. It kind of, there's a bigger like your body in the material world is situated, right? In all of the culture and all of the different social locations and all of that. The transcendence, right, is that.
Pause that really quick though. So, because that's so good. And I'm like, don't let anybody miss that. Catherine's saying that the body is situated in culture, like every message that we get around what a good body is, what a good human is, who's valuable, who's powerful, white bodies being above black and brown and people bodies and people of color, the idea that a thin body is better than, you can't take yourself out of it. So I continue, but that's so important. We're not just talking about, you know, empty theoretical social constructs. We're saying that you as a human, you're deeply enmeshed with all those messages.
Yeah, we could go way back to Foucault and that kind of philosophy and thinking us being so contextually situated within power. So for me, my understanding is that the transcendence is through the body and then through those power structures. Like then I get to be me feeling my mat, me breathing my breath in and of this moment, right? And I can transcend those really great. I had a little preparing, I was looking at like in particular what all this might feel like or the experiences we know about from the research for the transgender community or gender nonconforming. That community in particular is at higher risk due to the ongoing just distress of how they're situated in power and culture, right? Which ends up resulting in higher rates of eating disorders among that population. And Jacoby Bullard, I want to give you a quote. And Jennifer Webb described this in her really powerful article she did for our special issue, Realizing Yoga's All Access Path, a Social Justice Critique of Westernized Yoga and Inclusive Embodiment. So I can get you that article. I have a whole folder of those articles. I can give you all the PDFs. Just reach out to me. She has a quote in that article from Jacoby Bullard, social justice advocate. My practice has allowed me to be all of myself and to let all myself be seen without regret, guilt, or shame. So it's this ability to connect in and of your body and through it. And what we're transcending is all of those social structures. You can go all the way back to kind of how people used yoga in the past in India to transcend even colonialism, British colonialism, through being with the body and like taking the body back, right? So for me, the transcendence is in and of and through the body, not away from the body.
Yeah, there's a couple really good threads here. I mean, one, I suppose, I mean, you all who have been here before know that I like to kind of bookmark little practical things for you as yoga teachers. The bookmark in some of this conversation is be mindful of how you talk about the yoga philosophies and texts and how we talk about transcending the body and getting out of our experience. Actually, the balm for someone with an eating disorder is probably to come more deeply into their experience and really honor the preciousness of what it means to be a human. But I guess, Catherine, the question I'd put to you is, listening to that, you know, we're taking this word transcendence, which might not be the word we would have chosen, but we're pulling it from the yoga tradition. You know, the reality for someone who is in a body that's not valued in our society is that you can't transcend those structures right now. Like those structures aren't going anywhere. And I suppose one's lived experience in this time and place, wherever one is that you're meeting up with those structures every day. And sometimes that's a violent experience, and sometimes that's an oppressive experience. So I know it's a really difficult question, but can you speak a little bit to, you know, God, that's a very difficult question. I'm glad I'm the one asking it and not speaking to it.
There's a lot of evidence in all like how we internalize things like racism, we internalize the beauty ideals, we internalize the power structures, and that's part of what the researchers start with when they're looking at, you know, how do we create an intervention that's going to help someone be well, have well-being within the context of those structures and the tendency of the human being to internalize their culture and their exposure to these powerful structures. So how does it show up? We can look at how it shows up for people who are at risk for eating disorders. It shows up in constructs that we can then dismantle a bit. So it can show up like self-objectification. So self-objectification is when I see myself as an object because that's how the world sees me. And I'm going to be attractive to myself, valued by myself, only in terms of the context in which other people will value me externally. So I've internalized objectifying myself. So when I then, so this is Neva Peron, Diane Newmark-Stainer did a really fascinating piece in the special issue on embodiment and yoga and eating disorders. So then when I experience myself, my body as a subjective site of experience following my desires, my interoceptive experience, I shift away from objectification to subject. I get a subjective experience of being in my breath and in my body on the yoga mat. And so I flip that construct and how it shows up in my body. And we, in fact, have evidence that people who are at risk for eating disorders or have eating disorders who practice yoga have less self-objectification. And that's the mechanism through the concept of having a subjective experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And before you go to the next one, I think, you know, especially on a day like today, International Women's Day, you know, let's bring it to an example, right? I know me growing up and me developing an eating disorder, I definitely felt like my body's worth had to do with its its function, like how it was a tool for getting me through the world, right? If my body could be objectified, if it was valuable to the male gaze, then I'm a more valuable human. Or if, you know, if I check off all of these boxes, I'm more likely to get a job. And so what I hear Catherine saying a little bit is on the yoga mat, and you as yoga teachers, giving your students an ability to experience their bodies not as an object, but for as an experience in and of itself. That's what she means by subjective. You know, this body is yours. It's not here to please someone else. It's not here to do labor for someone else. It's not here to be used by someone else. It's yours. It's your opportunity to experience this, you know, precious thing it is to be human. So that's part of how and why yoga works. It's really deep. We've gone like way in the philosophical rabbit hole. Why does it work? Is it gives your students an opportunity to experience their body as their own rather than something to be used by someone else.
And if I can add here, so myself, Ann Cox, Tracy Tilka, and Diane Newmark-Stainer wanted to say, okay, do we have proof that how a yoga teacher teaches can affect that experience, right? So if I want my student to have this subjective, personal experience of self coming from their sensations, their breath. So we set up a randomized controlled trial where we had the teacher teach just calling poses, a teacher teach having, we set up a mindful awareness script where they were being cued to pay attention to their bodies and their sensations. And then we had a script where we had the person talking fitness and dieting kind of cues or changing your body cues. It was a really hard study to create because we're like, oh gosh, we have to expose people to this condition. But what we found was that the appearance-based yoga classes where we focused on appearance and what things look like and their fitness and losing weight, they increased body surveillance, which is you're paying attention to your body as a surveillance, right? Is it thin enough? Is it like the right size? Am I like, are my wrists, like we increased body surveillance and then decreased the forecasted pleasure someone thought they might have in the class. So just know we have randomized controlled trial. We could go into what that is, but we have kind of the gold standard evidence that if you cue that way, you will create risk, do harm.
Fantastic. That's very good. And we've got loads of other things. Catherine, just in the interest of time, because I can actually see our questions coming through, and if you all have other questions, please feel free to drop them in. Even if we don't get to them today, I'll throw them in for the Q&A webinar that I welcome you back to. Can you speak? So you've talked a little bit about this idea of experience over objectification, you know, experiencing the body as your own. Can you speak to either one or two other ways? Both that, you know, the research shows yoga works, particularly for this population, and then even practically what that looks, you spoke just so well right now to what that looks like in a class, but what that might look like in terms of teachers integrating those findings in how they teach.
Yeah, so teaching from anytime. So it's actually like just teaching really, it's really good yoga teaching, right? If you stick to what your mentors have taught you, that whenever I learn the stuff that's coming out in the research, and I just want to throw in before we're done to make sure that we've now done a meta-analysis that showed that, and that's including a whole bunch of studies and aggregating the data that shows that yoga does help in the prevention and treatment of eating disorders. Unequivocally, it does help. So then we get to the bigger question, okay, well, what kind of teaching helps is what Chelsea's asking. So whenever you're cueing to the experience of the body, to cueing your students to notice, have a mindful awareness of sensations, a mindful awareness of breath, to go into a pose and dial in what that pose feels like in their body, and then have them make a decision, go deeper, ease out. So now we're adding in choice, right? Cueing into how the breath affects the heartbeat, how the heartbeat affects the breath, right? What does it feel like to press down into the earth and reach my hands up and just notice that? And then maybe choose what's next. So every time you're cueing and like, right, you're bringing it back to the body and back to their experience over and over and over.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, I think I'm going to throw us to questions because we end up, I always shortcut the questions, and I find that we never get to answer as many. So I want to do it while Catherine's here. Unless, Catherine, do you have anything to add? Do you want to speak? I mean, I know we've gone down a singular rabbit hole that which was awesome, but anything you want to add before we move to questions?
Maybe I can just toss in a bunch of the things that matter that like kind of that
Sure.
we.
Yeah.
So here's some things we know for sure, that yoga decreases overall eating disorder pathology. So all the symptoms. We know in particular it will decrease binge eating and bulimic symptoms. We know that overall it will decrease body image concerns, and we know that the overall effect of yoga is to decrease eating disorder risk and symptoms. So that's the one thing we haven't shown yet is restraint, and that's restricting food intake. And the thing is, we haven't shown that it makes it worse, and we haven't shown that it makes it better. And that's actually we think is an okay thing, because that's the hardest thing to move in the treatment of eating disorders. And there has always been a concern that yoga might make that worse, and we know it doesn't. So yoga is safe for restrained eaters. That's what we believe at this time. And then all of the things that matter, I was mentioning a few of them, but helps with stress reactivity, depression, anxiety, emotion regulation, body image, body surveillance, self-criticism, mindfulness, self-compassion, body appreciation, functional appreciation, all these things. So there's a lot of research on the mechanisms and then the outcomes. And then we're just continuing to build on that body of evidence at this point.
Yeah, Catherine's really, I can't tell you how hard it is to do eating disorder research, specifically eating disorder research on yoga and yoga, because they're these two niches that don't get tons of funding. So to do the kinds of the type of research we need to be able to say with confidence, like Patricia just has, that according to science, we know this helps. It's really, you have to get a lot of funding, and you have to do really big randomized control trials with huge sample sizes. So Catherine's leading this charge. She's been building a body of evidence and really asking important questions. What types of yoga works? How does it work? And some of the things actually that she's mentioned around appreciating one's body, appreciating it for what it does rather than what it looks like. Reducing, one's tendency to diet, reducing one's tendency to eat past fullness signals, reducing one's tendency to use food to deal with those emotions. Those have come out of her research. I'm also going to plug, and Patricia did a wonderful thing throwing it into the chat, but we're on study 5 of several research studies on Eat, Breathe, Thrive, which is it's a yoga curriculum designed specifically for eating disorders that happens usually over 7 weeks, although we're doing a study on a 4-week version right now. And one of the most surprising things we found is that it reduces PTSD symptoms. So one thing our organization learned when we did this huge randomized control trial across 3 different countries, in I think 8 different cities, is that we didn't know this until Catherine did the study. Most of the people that came into that study met criteria for PTSD. We didn't know that. And we were trying to study a subclinical, meaning a not as severe sample. We wanted to look at people out in the community that were dealing with eating disorder issues that weren't anorexia and bulimia and binge eating disorder. And the surprising thing we found is most of these people, if they'd walked into a clinic, might have been diagnosed with PTSD. And the surprising thing we found is that the biggest impact yoga had was on PTSD symptoms. So there's loads of interesting stuff. If you go to Eat, Breathe, Thrive's website, we're trying to keep it updated. And we're waiting on Catherine's incredible graduate student, Esther Esty, who just got placed for a postdoc at Harvard. Speaking of International Women's Day, I'm going to celebrate that woman. After doing this huge study, she got sent to Harvard to do a postdoc, but her study is won an award for one of the, it's like one of the most prestigious awards you can win in this area. I'm just singing Esther's praises, and will soon be published in a couple different journals is what we're aiming for. So
yeah, and it was Esther's idea to look at trauma. So I was like, sure, let's do it. I think it is related. I think it will be important. And so it was the results were beyond what we even expected. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
all right,
anyway,
ladies, I'm going to jump in. I'm going to insert and assert myself. And so first say thank you. Super complex topic. And once again, we have merely scratched the surface. I want to dive in on a few things. First of all, I just want to clarify something that's important to know for the audience. Both of these women are yoga teachers. Chelsea very kindly refers to the audience as yoga teachers sort of as a framing tool. But both of these women do actually teach yoga. And now that I've said that, I want to check my own language and say, when we use this shorthand of saying yoga is proven to help people with eating disorders, we need to be specific and say what we're talking about. Are we talking about asana? Are we talking about meditation? Are we talking which aspect of yoga? I'm assuming we're talking about asana, but I'm checking that assumption. So Dr. Cook-Cottone, go for it.
Yeah, great question. So that's something we've been working on in the larger yoga researcher world, is being better documenting the aspects of yoga that are being integrated into the studies. So like Eat, Breathe, Thrive, some of the programs, I would say fewer than not, include a psychoeducational component where people learn about eating disorders. And so that's a smaller proportion. So that isn't yoga, it's psychoeducation.
And I would say asana, pranayama, and dhyana. We focus on those 3 limbs. So not just asana, yoga, breath, and meditation.
So most programs include the asana, meditation, and breathing work, and some include some additional relaxation. And the dosage of each is really important for the researchers to quantify in how they describe their protocol, so that we can replicate and extend and manipulate the amount of each in the studies, so we can better understand what contributes. And that's where the field is now, is trying to really understand that part. Like, what type of asana? Is there a particular lineage that is helpful? Is there a particular type of yoga that's good for a certain symptom set? So that's where we're trying to figure things out at this point. We don't know the answers to that right now.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. Based on what you do know and your research and your expertise, can you recap for us, because lots of folks are asking this question, and I myself as a yoga teacher have this question. Do you have a recommendation for how you give a cue that is anatomically correct without causing the harm that an anatomical cue could give? Or are you suggesting just don't, which I don't really know how that would work. But let me not put words in your mouth. Let me just ask a question.
No, I think about this all the time. So one thing I think about, and I'm not saying we've studied this is something I'm contemplating. And sorry, that's my dog Finnegan. That you would say, press your foot into the mat instead of press that foot into the mat. Do you know what I mean? So when I say that foot, that hand, that when I'm starting to objectify it like that, so keeping it very personal, like your foot, your leg, your arms. What we don't want to do, you can say all the body parts. Come here, bud. You can say all the body parts. That's fine. It's more that we want to say, like, let's do this pose to really get those glutes in shape. So now I'm talking about reducing the size or shape or building this shape, or let's get rid of some of that belly fat. It's time for our abdominal work. Like, I don't want to, like the kind of fitness class descriptions, we think those are the ones that are causing the harm. Where I bring awareness to and a focus on and a subjective experience of any body part, that is helpful. So notice
that is an awesome distinction. Thank you. So useful. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Did you have more to say about that?
No, I'm just going to give an example.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Please.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, and I say this all the time, but just note it, like press your thumb and your first finger into the mat, like thinking of down dog, you know, drop your heels toward your mat, take your chest back toward your thighs. Notice the back of your legs, notice sensation, breathe here in the pose, right? And so you're just cueing to their experiences and sensations, and it's your foot, your hands, right? Your breath, your choice, your body.
Thank you. I'm going to build on that. One of our most popular questions comes from Devorah, who is saying they're a mental health counselor and yoga teacher. Many of their clients find it distressing to be in their bodies. You all touched on this a little bit in your conversation. Can you say more about how you approach easing into an asana class, helping folks to avoid the perfectionism that comes about trying to get it right and things of that sort?
Yeah, in fact, some of our qualitative research says that one of the biggest challenges that's reported in those studies from people responding to interviews, like what is challenging for people who have an eating disorder in yoga is that feeling of vulnerability of being in the body, the feeling of connecting with your body, and then all the emotions that come with that, right? So then there's a variety of approaches that you can take. You know, and I can speak more clinically because this is another thing we need to sort out more in the research. But it will be really giving context. It's why programs like Chelsea's are so good, because they provide the discussion after, the psychoeducation before, where you can really learn, okay, here's some tools that I can use if I experience distress. Having tools like grounding, orienting, breathing to downregulate, making sure everybody knows ahead of time they have options to take a child's pose or take a break if they need to. So you really have a trauma-informed approach to the yoga practice, as well as a nice a container. We call it safer because it can never be perfectly safe, but where people have lots of choices and lots of tools and opportunities to discuss what's happening on the mat and what's happening in the session. Yeah.
Yeah, I would add to that a couple things. One thing Catherine said a bunch there is choice. So the word we use a lot is agency. It's making sure in your classes you are affirming each person's agency over and over and over again, affirming their ability to make a choice in what pose they take and how they are in the class. And then Catherine also spoke to something she speaks about a lot that I haven't given her the opportunity to hear, which is self-regulation. It's integrating those tools that you know can help them self-regulate naturally and organically in your class. Use your eyes as a teacher. Notice what's happening. If you're seeing twitching and you're seeing eyes darting and you're seeing anxiety build up, move them to a restorative pose. Start cueing the breath. Keep reminding them that if they're noticing something happening in their body, they can't, that is, you know, that needs a shift, that there are ways they can shift, and give them examples of it. So it's notice what you see and then create a space in your class where they feel a deep sense of permission to shift and to choose things that, you know, to take care of themselves.
And I wanted to also, so this is where, you know, it may be a longer workshop or webinar, we refer to scope of practice, right? So what is a yoga class? What is what's yoga, like teaching yoga, and then what's yoga therapy, and then what is therapy, right? And then how do we, for eating disorders, it's really important, especially if somebody's clinically diagnosed or at kind of needing a referral, that it's a treatment team. So we're working with an MD, we're working with a therapist, and we're typically also working with a nutritionist as part of the team. So knowing that we know that yoga works as an adjunct, right, to those other things, and we're not going to say, oh, you don't need treatment, you're in my yoga class. It would be that my yoga class is part of your whole recovery experience that includes that really solid team. So I hope, does that help clarify it too? Not thinking as a yoga teacher that we're going to do it all, because eating disorders are complex and actually very dangerous disorders, and most certainly you need a team.
Yes, and I would guess, although I don't know for sure, but just based on my personal lived experience and experience as a fitness professional, I would guess the vast majority of us are going to interact with far more people who are experiencing disordered eating than we are somebody with a diagnosed eating disorder. And if you don't know what I mean by the difference of that, you should come to the workshop on March 22nd. And because we're running out of time, so I can't give you the opportunity to explain that. We're going to dive to Liz's question, which is a very pertinent question for today. What do you both think about how the lasting impact of COVID might be as it intersects with eating disorders and disordered eating, particularly the huge expansion of folks, particularly in the US, accessing food from food banks or having trouble accessing food. There are so many lasting effects of this pandemic that we can't even possibly begin to imagine. But do you have some thought about, and also an invitation to say more about food insecurity? It's not a real question that just came from my brain to you, but I'm going to leave it there and let you react.
The food insecurity is going to be a big issue, and in terms of increasing risk, but also the other thing that's happening is people stuck at their house with their refrigerator, and so the responses are people are struggling with eating in the absence of hunger and binge eating, and then dieting, and then like getting really dysregulated, and a whole bunch of people just restricting. And around this area in Western New York, where I'm in Buffalo right now, the clinics are overwhelmed, and the inpatient treatment centers are overwhelmed. They're having to add beds. So right now, all indicators are that we're going to have a substantial spike in the clinical manifestation of eating disorders for a variety of reasons, of which you've named and I just detailed too.
I'll add that it's not the direct answer to food insecurity, but when Catherine and I launched this randomized control trial on our virtual program in January, we've done studies before. Our last randomized control trial took us 2 years. So we were like, buckle up. It's going to take another couple of years to get 200 people sample size. We launched it in January, and our goal was to get 200 people enrolled in the study. We got 170 applications within a couple of weeks, which is unprecedented for us. We've never seen anything like that. I can say for us as an organization, we are weekly having calls with folks with eating disorders that are at home and struggling with their issues and feeling suicidal. So severity has gone up tremendously. And there's a lot of people that don't have access to resources right now. So it's been a pretty tough year for folks with eating disorders.
Yeah. I'm going to bring us towards a close with actually by taking us back to the beginning of how the two of you met. And here's the thread. So interestingly, Dr. Cook-Cottone, you mentioned Dr. Jennifer Webb. She was a guest on YA Digital, I believe it was last week, and she was presenting her research on perceptions of yoga in the media. Hugely popular session. If you missed it, the link is at yourya.org. And tying that to your involvement with Lululemon and raising awareness there. I admittedly have had a long-standing bias against that brand because of the origin story of how it was formed. If you don't know, I will let you look it up. And I'm not alone. And so folks are, first of all, thanking you for your advocacy and helping them to evolve as a brand. And also just wondering if you would like to say or offer your opinion about how they have evolved as a brand, if you feel like that your advocacy was effective.
No pressure. Catherine, can I speak to this a little bit? You can as well. When our organization first got a call from Lululemon, created a social impact program called Here to Be and committed, I forget how many $1 million a year, but many $1 million a year toward investing in nonprofits that increase access to yoga. And when we first got that call, I was like, I've got no interest in talking to Lululemon. Don't, like they're doing brand cleanup. You know, of course they want to talk. I connected with two women in particular who shared their own experiences of eating disorders. They worked for Lululemon, shared their own experiences of eating disorders, shared their intention with the nonprofit program and what they wanted to create, and shared a personal and transparent experience of what it feels like to work within a company like that and what they hoped to achieve from within the company. And suffice it to say that they pulled on my heartstrings, and I wondered about the possibility of working with a large, impactful corporation to achieve change. And the analogy I give a lot is you can stand outside the monster in the machine and yell about how bad it is and point out all the ways that it's doing harm, which is a very effective way to achieve change, by the way. And sometimes it can be useful to crawl into the machine, start to get to know the people pulling the levers and go, oh, do you have any idea what kind of impact this is having on the world? And I've found that path to be useful, not always, right? There's sometimes I hit roadblocks and I'm like, are you kidding me? And sometimes I have moments where I'm like, wow, look what just happened. Look, they've just expanded their sizing. They've just, most of the emails I'm getting right now are not white women, like in terms of imagery. So I feel conflicted about it often, and I wonder about it, and I'm in inquiry around it. I've never felt like our integrity has been at risk. I've never felt like my ability to speak to the problems has ever been stifled. And I feel like, however we're going to get to change, we should be utilizing all avenues, whether it's standing outside or working from within. And I clearly feel very passionately about that. So
I would echo that, and I strongly feel, especially when we're talking about how society shows up in our body, and that can be eating disorders, it can be trauma, but it is this inside outside phenomenon. And so my whole life to be in the change, people say, I don't want to do academia, that academic structure is elitist, but then how do we change? It's like I'm in and of it, right? And so I really feel strongly about partnering wherever I can and teaching whenever I can. And so that's the approach that I've taken. And the funding for eating disorders, I give the company credit for they gave us a substantial amount of money to do this study. People are not funding eating disorder research, so I give credit for that. And that was part of Chelsea and my willingness to partner with them to help this research come to light and really help others. And I'm willing to partner going forward. I just feel like it's the only way that we are going to move forward is together, right?
Yeah, I agree. I have very often been the person outside screaming, and sometimes you got to do both. And I think you both. We are past time, so I'll just finish by saying that I was reminded today of a very important piece of yoga philosophy and life lesson, which is you have to meet people where they are if you're hoping to affect change. And that is very often easier said than done.
Sure.
But the two of you have brought us such wonderful information. I thank you both for your time today, and also more importantly, for all of the work that you do to improve the health and well-being of people around the world. I hope that those of you in the audience will check out the recordings and also join us again on March 22nd for Q&A on yoga and eating disorders, Dr. Catherine Cook-Cottone and Chelsea Roff. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Yoga Alliance community, and hope to see you again soon.
All right.
Can I share the slides really quick on where they can find us, Patricia? No?
Sure, yeah, go for it.
Super quick, just so you all can see where to find Catherine and I, do this really quick. I am at eatbreathethrive.org. You can find me. I'm newly on Instagram again, but you can send a message on Instagram. I mostly take pictures of dogs and pretty places. And then here's Catherine, much more active than I am on Instagram, and that's her website. And then we also offer a discount to Yoga Alliance attendees. And I know a Q&A webinar sounds really boring, but we're just taking all of your questions and answering them. So it's anything we missed in these webinars. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Patricia of Yoga Alliance team.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good week.
Thank you.